Hey guys, how are you? What's going on in the world? What are you eating for dinner later? I feel like I've talked about and thought about what I'm eating for dinner more recently than I have ever before in my entire life. I don't know if that's just me. But what are you eating? Chicken curry? What about curry chicken? Dumplings? Are you having Chinese dumplings? Or dumplings like you eat with chicken? Or from Popeyes? Biscuits? But biscuits that are cookies, or biscuits that are crackers, or biscuits that are dumplings but not the dumplings, like pot sticker. It gets really confusing. Are you having rice? Rice and peas? Or rice and beans? Are you having rice at the end of the meal? Or with the meal? Are you having brown rice? Sticky rice? Leftover rice? Ew, I know. My mom loves leftover rice. She also likes leftovers. I don't know, she's weird. Happy birthday, Mom. It's her birthday. So we're talking about subsistence this week, right? We eat food differently, but we also eat food the same, right? So food preparation, this is a cultural universal. It's one of the things that makes humans unique among all other living organisms on the planet. We prepare our food, but the way we prepare it, right? What we think of as food, the traditions surrounding food are different. But what we eat says a lot about who we are, also who we're not, where we're from. All right, hold on. Hey, Pandita, stop licking. It's gross and distracting. She's just so extra. So anyway, what we eat says a lot about who we are and who we aren't, right? Where we're from and what we think of as good to eat versus not good to eat. Cultural norms, attitudes, and like these identities around eating are called foodways. But what about where our food comes from, right? So think past the grocery store, right? Do you know? Each meal that you have is part of a diet that's generated by a subsistence system. Subsistence system. It's tricky. And that system is made up of strategies that are used by various people and at various scales to feed a population. So today we're going to talk about subsistence systems and foodways, or what we eat, how we get it, and what we think about all of that, and how it impacts all other aspects of our cultural lives and systems. So subsistence is important. And one of the reasons subsistence is important, it's not just because like we have to eat, but it's because similar subsistence strategies anthropologically are associated with a lot of similar traits in societies that otherwise might seem totally different. Because everywhere around the world, right, we all work in some way every day to put food on the table. We are all like right now involved in subsistence. We're either consumers, producers, or distributors of food. Now, what I wonder, I don't think Pandita fits into this, right? I mean, I guess she's a consumer of food. I guess, but she's not like really working, but whatever. The other thing I wonder about this, and I don't know if these are things you think about, but maybe you should. How does this work in the zombie apocalypse, right? Because like zombies don't produce food. They don't eat other zombies. And all that they do is eat people and then turn people who were food into zombies who aren't good to eat anymore. And if like the population of zombies keeps growing and zombies don't die and pose a serious threat to humans, then zombies would outpace the carrying capacity of the land or the amount of people a given area can support. And they do that pretty quickly. And then would they starve to death? It's like, it's not an effective survival strategy to become a zombie. at the very least, like, it doesn't seem like we would keep having zombie attacks on the planet. I guess it's a maladaptive trait, right? So we'll talk about that later. But anyway, whatever. You can write about it in the comments or in your journal. So back to subsistence systems. What anthropologists do is they create categories of classification. So they can compare cross-culturally and they can find patterns. So we have 4 different modes of subsistence. We have foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, and agriculture. We are agriculturalists. That does not mean that you are a farmer. Doesn't mean that you know a farmer. Doesn't mean that you've ever been to a farm, but maybe you have. What it means is that our society is based on large-scale food production through the domestication and cultivation of plants and animals. So what's really interesting to me, at least, is that it's not just about the way that we get food. The way that we get food is linked to the way that we organize our population, the level of inequality and wealth that exists, if wealth exists at all. It's linked to the type of, or the extent of violence in a society, and other types of institutions and structures of relationships. Also, subsistence strategies are adaptations to particular environments and contexts, and different societies can adapt to the same environment in different ways or in similar ways, right? So there's all of these factors that come into play. So back to these types. Okay, so foragers. Foragers rely on food collection, hunting and gathering, to get their food. Pastoralism is where people raise and then generally follow herds of domesticated animals like cows and goats or maybe camels. Horticulture is the small scale planting of crops that are meant for domestic subsistence. And agriculture, as we're talking about it now, is the cultivation and domestication of plants and animals using technologies that allow for intensive use of the land. The difference between horticulture and agriculture is that horticulturalists generally produce food for themselves or their local surroundings, while intensive agriculturalists generally produce food to generate surplus and to trade and for profit. So let's start with foragers. Some of the most studied and well-known foragers are the Jobe Johuansi or the Klikkung, also known as the San people. They live in the areas surrounding Botswana. So foragers tend to have a broad spectrum diet, which means they eat a lot of different stuff. They do this in one of 2 ways, right? So either they live a nomadic lifestyle, so they're moving around, or they live in areas like the Pacific Northwest where like salmon and the biodiversity of this like really intense river system provided such an abundance of food resources that like a lot of indigenous groups maintain settled or sedentary lifestyles. Foraging societies tend to be small, in part because it's hard to move with lots of people, and also because more mouths to feed puts more pressure on the environment. And there's a limit, right? Foragers tend to space out their kids more than agriculturalists. So with 4 years in between children being the amount of time, the average amount of time for foragers, while when agriculture was first starting, the average time span between children was about 2 years. For foragers, the population density is going to be super low with around like 5 people per square mile on average. So just for comparison's sake, in Brooklyn, there are about 36,732 people per square mile. Foraging in Brooklyn. The zombie apocalypse in Brooklyn. Things to think about. So foragers also tend to be egalitarian, right? So that means that nobody has more power than anyone else. There's no concept of private property when you're moving and you're totally sharing resources and you're not accumulating wealth or surplus, so there's no real material inequality, right? There's also a tendency to place a high value on sharing and generosity. And so like these daily habits of giving and receiving over time reinforce ideas about inequality. So like you come back from your hunting or your gathering and you have, you know, this big gazelle or a lot of roots, you're not dividing them up and then deciding who gets what. It's collectively owned, right? Everything belongs to everyone. And just because you found it or you procured it doesn't mean you get like the best or the biggest. It's divided amongst everyone equally, because there's no concept of private property that's allowed to exist, right? Or that is not sort of strictly negatively reinforced, is a better way of saying it, through social norms and customs. So that doesn't mean that everybody's the same. So men and women often have different jobs, and, you know, really old people and really young people, right, are limited in the types of work that they can do, but everybody's involved in subsistence in some way. Now, for a long time, and I mean, I don't know, maybe even now, before you've taken this class and learned to think relativistically about both the past and the present, hunter-gatherers were often seen as like backwards or primitive or living in the past, and, you know, they were slaving away and they're suffering and they're always on the brink of starvation, and oh my God, their lives must just be terrible. But in the 1960s, Marshall Sahlins challenged that view when he wrote that foragers were the original affluent society. So affluence means wealth. And the idea that no one is poor because people's wants are satisfied. So poverty is a social status, according to Sahlins. It's not an economic one. And that's a big idea. When needs and wants are all satisfied, nobody's poor. Sahlins argues that in industrialized agricultural societies like ours, poverty exists because of the increasing gap between our unlimited wants and our necessarily insufficient means of satisfying those wants. And that's what capitalism is based on. But also, foragers don't live in isolation, right? And they never have. They're impacted by the governments that they live under, policies regarding land use or reservations, conflicts with other groups or farming communities, all that stuff. And global climate change has drastically impacted their ability to rely on the environment to provide food. So pastoralism is the next one we're going to talk about. That's when groups of people rely on herds of domesticated livestock. Most of the world's pastoralists live in Africa, but there are also large populations in Central Asia, in Tibet, in the Arctic Scandinavia, and in Siberia. So pastoralists, they tend to be nomadic or semi-nomadic because herds have to graze, and so they need to move. A nomadic lifestyle also helps avoid governmental restrictions and competition and conflict with neighbors. Pastoralists tend to rely on their herds not for meat, so they don't kill them, but instead for milk and other resources like wool or even dung. Guys, dung is poop. It can be dried, and it can be used as fuel, or it's used to build houses. Pastoralists tend to have more involved trading and economic connections with neighboring farming communities, right, than foragers do, because of the limits on the types of food that they can obtain. Okay, so foraging lifestyles look really different than pastoralist lifestyles. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. So number one, the amount of work that it takes to care for such large numbers of animals, right? So the Maasai, who live in East Africa, have been studied extensively by anthropologists. Their domestic lives revolve almost entirely around the management of cattle herds. They measure wealth and social status in accordance with the number of cows a person owns. So like, you know, you're like big man on the block if you have more cows than the next guy, right? But cows are way too much work for anyone to accomplish individually, so the Maasai labor in really large family units that are organized around polygynous marriages, and polygynous means multiple marriages, but specifically multiple wives, right? Qualities. It's kind of interesting, right? Sex, love, romance, and the prohibitions surrounding it cross-culturally. I don't know. So, I mean, here, though, we see gender roles and marriage practices structured in relationship to subsistence. But wealth, property, and conflict are also structured in the same way. So pastoralists tend to have a lot of wealth in comparison to foragers, in part because they have animals, right? So that's wealth. But also because they have herds to carry around their stuff. So when you have stuff and you have stuff to carry around stuff, you just got more stuff. It makes sense. But what pastoralists don't have is concepts of private property and ownership of land. And again, this relates directly back to, it's not caused by, but there's a fit between ideas and ideologies, right? And subsistence strategies. So land that's used for common purposes regarding grazing is communal land, and they have complex management systems that rotate grazing land seasonally and geographically. This maintains the health of the land and the health of the herds and, you know, the health of the people and the larger society. And we have things like tourism pressures, where countries are sort of pressured to create privately owned safaris to bring in tourists. And these lands are then restricted from grazing. Or cities and farms sort of press into traditional pastoralist territory, or global climate change intensifies periods of drought. You know, we have famines, we have war. Things get tricky, and the stressors are challenges that groups now, you know, struggle to manage and to address. And they're doing so in innovative ways, right? But in the same way that the way that we organize ourselves to get what we need from our environment impacts all other parts of our society, changes to the way we get what we need from our environment, changes to strategies for subsistence and this larger system as a whole, have a ripple effect, right? It impacts marriages, it impacts conflict, it impacts conflict resolution, you know, and power within a society, right? So this is something that we'll see more if you look at some of the slides in the attached videos. Now, horticulturalists. Horticulturalists are farmers. And they're just farmers who grow things on a smaller scale than intensive agriculturalists. And remember, we're intensive agriculturalists, big factory farms. So horticulturalists, they're growing things small scale. Those things are intended to feed themselves or their local communities. They're not going to be sold for profit usually. You see horticultural systems in Asia, in South and Central America, and the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia. I think I already said that. And in the little islands around Australia. So horticulturalists tend to grow and eat a variety of crops. And the reason that they grow a variety of crops, not just one, is to avoid depleting the land and to maximize efficiency. So instead of using pesticides, fertilizers, and irrigation, like intensive agriculturalists in the United States, horticulturalists do things like rotate the fields that they use and grow crops in combinations that are more efficient, right? So like beans and corn grow together really efficiently. Things like that. So when we talk about agriculture, specifically intensive agriculture as it's practiced today, we're talking about, it's a whole different ballgame. The impacts of agriculture on the world and the population have such far-reaching effects, we can't like ever go back to this state of nature or to the way things were before. You know, we couldn't simply move out of our apartments and start foraging. There's not enough land, right, to support us. So Agriculturalists have some things in common. First, there tends to be a reliance on a staple crop that provides the bulk of the calories. That might be wheat, it could be cassava, it could be fufu, it could be yams, it could be rice, it could be pasta, corn, like whatever. But that reliance is going to lead to monocropping. So mono is one crop. It's like a thing that grows in the ground. And that means focusing on growing one crop instead of a whole variety of crops. So, I mean, think about the impacts of that. That was weird. I don't know if that worked or not. I mean, right? What are the impacts? Well, one crop, if you like are only growing corn and a corn pandemic comes, you know, your crop is gone, you have no food, if you're a farmer, you have no money. But if you're growing many different kinds of crops and a corn pandemic comes, then it's like, you know, the corn is gone, but at least you have all this other stuff, right? Corn is going to use up certain resources from the soil. And if you're only growing corn, those resources, how are they going to replenish? If you're growing lots of different things, right, they're going to use different resources. It's more of a symbiotic relationship. You could rotate pastures so that, you know, the corn grows in this pasture or this field, you know, in 1 year, and it grows someplace else somewhere. You can't do that if you're just growing corn. Also, you know, let's say people stop eating corn. Done. Your farm out of business. How about health-wise, right? We're not getting all the nutrients that we could get if we had a broad spectrum diet, because our diets, right, are part of a larger subsistence system that focuses on about, you know, 12 different staple crops that don't have a lot of nutrients but are dense in calories. So, I mean, with monocropping, what happens is you're basically putting all of your eggs in one basket. Yeah, there's risk entailed, and there's negative and positive consequences. You know, it's a way of producing enough food to feed a really large population, but that's not the only impact. So now, also, there's a link between intensive agriculture and an increase in population density. So what that means is that when we start farming intensively using machines, right, this sort of industrialized farming that we do today, we are able to feed more people. We also, well, as we're able to feed more people and the population grows, we have to continue to grow more food, right? More food leads us to more people. More people requires more food. It's a cycle, right? And it's one that we're stuck in unless some pretty like tragic or drastic extreme events take place to change that. Like a zombie apocalypse, right? I don't know. So now, third, agricultural societies tend to have a system where labor is divided, right? And people specialize in things like professing anthropology, or like making YouTube makeup videos, or like, I don't know, being LeBron James. Do we still care about LeBron James? I don't know anything about sports. This is something, you can make me a YouTube video about sports and tell me. But so this specialization and division of labor can only happen because intensive agriculture allows for a surplus of production, right? So not everybody has to be involved in subsistence because we can make more than we need and we can store it. So now with agriculture, we have specialization, which leads to differences in wealth. Then that leads to inequality. We have concepts of private property that develop as people start intensively farming their land. And then we have conflicts over resources. We have environmental degradation on a large scale, right? Cows produce methane gas when they fart, and that is one of the largest causes of ozone layer degradation. Cow farts. Did you know that? Sure. But okay, so that's okay because we can produce enough food to feed the world, right? So it's like that's what we need to do. Kind of. We can produce enough food to feed the world. We produce more than enough food to feed the world. But we don't feed the world. So go back to like the question I asked at the very beginning of this video. When I asked about what you were eating for dinner, right? Think about where your food comes from. And once we get past the grocery store, it's like it probably comes from really far away. Food production and distribution in an industrialized agriculturalist society is part of a world economic system. So thinking again holistically, right, at how all of these various factors come together in a systemic way, impacting one another. A world economic system is a complex web that links all parts of the world in economic exchange. But not all areas are positioned equally. Food travels, right? And as it travels, it passes through a lot of different hands or like middlemen. And just like anything else, every time you have a middleman involved, they're taking some off the top. So the value of the product is increasing. But what that means is that my coffee beans, right, cost me $11 a pound at the grocery store, but the growers who produced them were only paid around $1.50 per pound. And so all that money in the middle is going to large corporations, wholesalers, distributors, right? And farmers are struggling as these larger corporations are able to sort of exert pressures and control markets in ways that disrupt traditional economies. So, I mean, that's a problem, especially when food that's nutritious and abundant becomes so highly valued, right, in the international arena that it makes more sense to sell it than to eat it. And we're going to see the consequences of that phenomena in regards to quinoa and the Peruvian highlands in a video that is also linked in the slideshow that I posted. So food's one of those things that, I mean, especially in New York, we think about and we don't think about. We eat. But how we get it is a process that links us to other people in ways that are equitable or inequitable and have productive and destructive potentials. So look at the PowerPoint slides and presentations, do the reading, watch the videos. I have a bunch of short videos that I included, and think about these things in your journal entries and then decide how you want to live and the choices you want to make. All right, be well, guys. I'll see you soon. Don't miss my face too much. Pandita says hi. She's not really into this video, but she'll be here for the next one. All right.